It sure seems like I have gone out and bought a Grimm Audio MU2. It is this little box right here. It's a streamer and DAC that retails for something like
18,000 euro.
So what cursed insanity can make a person buy something like this? I'm gonna try to explain. Welcome to Yukiro Music. This is a very long video, I know, but a product of this sort of sophistication and complexity and price kind of needs a little bit more context and information than if you're, shopping for a hairdryer. I've tried to divide it into chapters. You can click through below in the description box. You have timestamps for different segments. But I've also tried to make sure that this is worth your time throughout, start to end. This video is not going to be a review in the traditional sense. A review would try to look at a product's strengths and weaknesses and see how it fits into the overall market of competing products and brands and so on. And it would try to take a sort of objective-ish look at how this one product under review would fit into a variety of different systems for different people with different preferences. And I'm not doing that today. I'm just talking about my system and my preferences and how I ended up picking this out of everything that's out there. So it's a very subjective video, but let's start this off with some objective information about the Grimm Audio MU2. This thing is basically 3 boxes in one. And for my tastes, too much of hi-fi and certainly high-end audio is about having lots of boxes, as if that's some sort of goal unto itself. I prefer, at least these days, to minimize clutter. While, of course, I want to retain sound quality and features. But if you reflexively unzip your pants at the mere thought of a 10-box hi-fi system, then, you do you. I'm not going to interfere. The first thing this does is that it's a preamplifier. And it used to be that a digital volume control would sacrifice sound quality to attenuate the signal. That isn't really the case anymore with modern designs, but regardless, the MU2 uses a very sophisticated analog volume control, which lets the whole thing function as a pure analog preamplifier. It has one XLR and one RCA input, and both remain analog all the way through to the output. So while I still use an integrated amplifier, I could change that for a dedicated power amp and lose no functionality now that I have the MU2 in my system. The MU2 is also a streamer, and streaming audio is how most of us listen to music today, either from a subscription service or from locally stored files. Beyond just playing the song or album that you search for, I think there's a bunch of features that a streamer could and should supply. The first is, of course, streaming from a lossless subscription service. Second is streaming local files, and I want the local files to be streamed from inside of the unit so that it isn't dependent on the sort of uptime and functionality of an external unit, such as a NAS. But I do also want it to be able to stream from a NAS in case I have a very large library or run out of disk space or something like that. It should also have some degree of intelligence to be able to recommend me artists and records based on my listening patterns. And I want very rich metadata. Just a, artist and album name and track title isn't really enough, I think. Then I want a unified, responsive, and intuitive interface that takes all of this together. And lastly, I would want to be able to access this, of course, locally, like in the room, in the house, but also remotely, like if I'm out walking the dog or if I'm on the other side of the planet. For the past decade now, I have used Roon to stream music, and these days it can do all of the things that I just listed. So I actually find Roon to be so compelling for me personally that I haven't even looked at the competition for several years now, even out of curiosity. Do let me know in the comments if I'm missing something better. But it just so happens that the Grimm Audio MU2 relies entirely on Roon as its streaming interface. Now there is a big software update coming for the MU2 that will add UPnP, Universal Plug and Play, Tidal Connect, and possibly something more. But those things aren't going to be able to do all the things that I just listed Roon as being capable of doing. So if you are going to buy one of these, or the MU1, it's DAC-less streamer-only elder sibling, you definitely need to figure out if Roon feels right for you and your preferences and your needs. Since the MU2 is also a DAC, I could just take another streamer with another interface and connect it to one of the digital inputs. But then I would be paying for a very ambitious streamer in here that I wouldn't be using. Now, speaking of very ambitious streamers, I'm actually fairly skeptical against them. Like, there's a lot of like ultra high-end, very, very pricey streamers out there that don't have a DAC component, that just stream the digital data. And like on a theoretical level, I don't understand how there's any justification for them. And I say theoretical because I haven't tried them. And I've had my convictions been proven very wrong before, which is a good thing because being proven wrong means you learn something. But right now, I remain skeptical. At the core of this skepticism is that even a very modest streamer can send out all the ones and zeros in the right order. And an even just reasonably well-built one will do so, at least today, with vanishingly low jitter, which is the timing error between the ones and zeros. And besides, if there is something that a fancy streamer does to its output that improves the sound of a DAC receiving that signal, surely a well-designed DAC could do the same thing to that signal on the receiving end instead. Anyway, that doesn't matter in the case of the MU2 because the DAC and streamer are built together. If you want this sound, you buy the box that has both. But let's move on for now to the last major feature of the MU2, which is its DAC. And major feature indeed. The DAC portion of the MU2, that design, is actually called the major DAC in Grimm Audio's internal parlance. It serves both the internal streamer and also external sources like a CD transport or whatever you want to connect to it. Now, some of you might rightfully wonder how much nuance there could possibly be to the conversion of ones and zeros into voltages, which is what a DAC does. And yes, there are DACs today that measure extremely well, sometimes better than the MU2, and that sells for just a fraction of this amount of money. But if you have actually listened and compared DACs in a reasonably ambitious system, you probably know by now that they don't all sound the same. Now, of course, something sounding identifiably different doesn't automatically mean that it's better. But different can be better, and to my ears, the MU2 is better in a different way. DACs are a very mature category of devices today, but it seems there still are errors or distortions that tend to happen in the conversion to analog that, while they are quantitatively much, much smaller than the errors inherent to vinyl playback, for example, they detrimentally impact enjoyment more, at least for some of us. And maybe it's because the errors that happen in digital are simply more unnatural, in that there's like no analog to them in nature. You know, like playing a vinyl record is a needle tracing a groove. That's a mechanical process that has mechanical distortions. It is a category of distortion that is related to how sound has behaved in everything we've heard in our entire lives. But what happens in digital has no such analog. And so it might be that while these errors are very, very tiny, they are simply less palatable. Now, exactly what these digital errors are is a gigantic topic, and I'm not going to cram it into this video. It's already long as it is, and it's about a personal journey and not, digital audio 101. But it's something I'm going to get back to because I'm going to talk about digital products more in the future, and this lies at the core of that very topic. I mention all of that, though, because the MU2 appears to be doing digital to analog conversion in a way that, to my knowledge, hadn't exactly been done before. And with this design, Grimm are trying to tackle some of these measurably small but subjectively important characteristics. If you're curious about the technical details of this, go to Grimm's website. They're really forthcoming about how they designed this DAC and not trying to hide behind a bunch of voodoo. So if you're technically inclined, that's a good read. Okay, with that mostly objective stuff out of the way, let's zoom out a little bit and see how I ended up picking this out of the almost endless sea of options that are out there. As you might have seen in my videos about music, I really love vinyl. Perhaps in part because of some fetishism for the format itself, but genuinely also because when I play vinyl, it gets under my skin a little bit deeper, a little bit more reliably than with digital. And yes, this is despite the measurably inferior dynamic range and distortion and channel separation and all that. You might have heard some people argue that this deeper emotional connection with analog is some inherent trait of the medium that digital can never approach. I tend to think that is not true, because it also happens with records that at some point in the production toolchain have been digital, which is frankly the case with the vast majority of my records. So I think that for me, the reason why vinyl is more rewarding, at least up until now, is just that my vinyl playback equipment, turntable and tone arm and cartridge and phonostage, having just cost more money than my digital source. I'm not saying that more money always and automatically equals better sound, but for the most part, you get more ambitious components when you spend more money. And if you spend it on the right components for you personally, that extra spending should yield more pleasure. And sure enough, more money on analog has given me more pleasure than less money on digital. And so since long before the MU2 even existed, I've had this idea on the back burner that I should try to level the playing field here a little bit, trying to combine the practicality of digital with the emotional rewards of analog. And when I say the practicality of digital, what I mean is actually Rune, because digital can be very impractical and Yankee if you use different interfaces. And so in line with my skepticism against fancy streamers, I've been using this increasingly geriatric MacBook Pro as my Rune core. And I've used a Mac because it allows me to connect to my Weiss DAC 202, which has FireWire input. That was a protocol that Apple championed early. It was on the original iPod, for example. This computer doesn't have FireWire, but it has Thunderbolt, so I've been able to use an adapter from the Thunderbolt ports into the DAC. Now, aesthetically, I've never liked having a laptop in my hi-fi system. I don't think it's a good look. So maybe I should just get a Mac Mini instead. Well, turns out then that as of Mac OS 26, Apple have deprecated FireWire support even over Thunderbolt. So if I upgrade my Rune core to something a little bit more purpose-built, like their own line of Nucleus products, for example, I wouldn't have FireWire or Thunderbolt, so I would have to connect to a different input on the DAC, but I need those other inputs for other sources. So all of that is just to say that sooner or later, I'm going to have to replace both the Rune core and DAC. Now, despite all that, I wasn't in a rush to upgrade. My Yankee setup kind of worked as long as I didn't touch anything the wrong way. But then I read Michael Laborna's review of the MU2 on his website, Twittering Machines. That review actually starts with the following paragraph. If you want to hear the best digital music reproduction I have heard by an obvious and distinct margin, you'll need to find a Grimm MU2 to listen through. Now, Michael has heard a lot of high-end gear over his career as a reviewer. I think he's an excellent writer. He's not prone to hyperbole the way some reviewers might be. He is someone whose taste is both well established and actually pretty close to my own. So I struggle to think of a reviewer whose words carry more weight for me personally. So when he said the best about something that would fit perfectly for me from a functionality standpoint, I got very, very curious. It took me a frustratingly long time to be able to follow his advice and listen to an MU2. And while I was patiently trying to make that happen, I try to not get too attached to the idea of the MU2 being perfect for me, because it is a type of bias that it's easy to slip into. And it was very difficult because everything I read, and I did read everything about this thing, everything just praised it to the heavens. So like I mentioned in my video about home auditioning for hi-fi equipment, click here-ish if you haven't seen that video, we as consumers owe it to ourselves to question whether a product is truly the right one for us. And with something this expensive, you better make sure it's the right choice. So I began looking for other components that seemed to have sort of comparable performance and features. And one name in particular came up in the context of the MU2 in almost every review and forum thread, and that was Playback Designs with their top model, the MPD-8, and the newer and slightly less pricey MPD-6. Thanks to a retailer here in Stockholm, Sweden, Perfect Sense, I was able to eventually get both an MU2 and an MPD-6 with its optional streaming module that makes it Roon compatible for home loan and evaluation. Now, you already know that I settled on the MU2, so there's no cliffhanger moment here, but let me tell you some anecdotes from the decision-making process. First, comparing the MU2 to my 14-ish-year-old Weiss DAC 202, that wasn't really like a night and day difference. And it actually rarely is with DACs in general, and certainly at this performance level. But I do hear some differences. The Weiss feels slightly drier, not in the sense of like tail ends of reverbs being truncated or something like that, but drier in its sonic texture. As if music is sometimes a tiny little bit less silky and glossy. It's a little bit more matte and powdery. That makes the 202 feel, and by comparison, sometimes a little less saturated. Now, if you've heard the DAC 202 or the follow-ups, the 501 and the 502, you might be wondering what the heck I'm talking about here because they are exquisitely silky in their sound. It's just that the MU2 is even better at that. Back when I bought this, one thing that drew me to it was that it sort of paints an incredible cloud of sound. And that cloud might be even bigger than what the MU2 does. Whether that is correct or desirable is a different question, but it's a difference between the two. But if there's one main takeaway difference, it's this. Given the task of assembling ones and zeros into music, the Weiss gives me a perfectly focused view of every texture and line of the puzzle pieces, whereas the MU2 makes me feel like I'm inside the picture of the puzzle. Now, do I want the truth of the puzzle or do I want the truth of the picture? So what about the Playback Designs MPD-6? Well, in Roon, you can group multiple endpoints so that they play in sync, which is great for multi-room setups, for example. So I did that with the MU2's internal DAC as well as the Roon endpoint built into the MPD-6. And then I connected both to my integrated amplifier and I could just switch input on the amplifier for a super quick and entirely seamless A/B test sort of setup. Now I had the levels slightly mismatched at first, which is embarrassing, but once I got that settled, it was really difficult to hear any difference at all. And when there was some tiny difference, it wasn't obviously better or worse. But over time, as I was switching between the two, I began noticing a pattern that ended up being pretty important for my decision-making process. And that is that it was extremely rarely that switching to the MPD-6 felt like a step in the wrong direction. But it was also true that at 0 times did it feel like it was an improvement. Inversely, switching to the MU2 also rarely felt like a change at all, but somehow I more often wanted to stay there. And when I did stay, it was the one of the two that moved me the most. This back and forth was not done blindly. I knew which was which the whole time. And so if you're now frothing at the mouth, eager to declare that my conclusions just stem from my own biased pre-existing excitement for the MU2, then I can't prove that you're wrong, but also you can't prove that you're right. So here we are. But for what it's worth, a friend of mine spent 4 hours in here not knowing which was which, flipping back and forth, and he arrived at the exact same conclusions that I had. And like I've said before in other videos, I seem to have a lot more trust in my connection to my emotional response than what the blind A/B preaching objectivists do. And I mean, if you don't trust my trust in my emotions, buddy, it doesn't sound like my problem. Now, to be fair, 20 years ago, I probably didn't have this degree of confidence in my ability to gauge my emotional response to sound. This takes a lot of time to develop and mature. And I'm not saying I'm done either. I have biases, of course I do. I'm not immune to them. But if you think that no emotions can ever be trusted in audio, I don't really know why you're into music in the first place. Anyway, when I wasn't A/B hopping between the two, but rather spent longer listening sessions with one and then the other, my impressions actually persisted and I think even strengthened. I just became a tiny little bit more engaged and immersed and affected when listening through the MU2. Now, not by a huge amount, but by a consistent and meaningful amount. Now, I understand if paying this sort of mega bucks for tiny differences seems like insanity, and I'm sure there are plenty of cases where it truly is insanity, but the perceived magnitude of a difference doesn't necessarily correlate to the impact of that difference. The right kind of tiny difference can be transformative. A tiny little bit of extra salt on a complex and ambitious dish, or a couple of degrees warmer air on a spring morning, or a fractional adjustment of your prescription lenses, they can all nudge something mediocre into being fantastic for your specific tastes and needs and desires. And to my ears and to my heart, the MU2 offers this kind of small but profound nudge towards the fantastic. Interestingly, the sonic improvements that I heard, the sort of rightness of music, was noticeable also with music that was entirely unknown to me, so stuff I'd never heard before. And that kind of means to me that there's something about the texture of all sounds coming out of the MU2, a sort of universal quality where it just makes things feel right in a way that I honestly wasn't sure that digital could do. I should point out here that the MPD6 impressed me in this regard as well. With both of them, I feel like I could just listen forever, and they kept me focused and interested in a way that I don't recall having been with digital in a very long time. Both units invited me to play very loud, not because lower volume didn't sound good, but because loud volumes were so pleasant. There's a sort of purity and relaxation to the sound that makes it remarkably non-fatiguing despite very long sessions with loud levels. Now, like I said, I see other people making this exact same comparison. And so depending on your preferences and expectations and system and music, it might be that Playback Designs is the better choice. It's just that, for me, Grimm won. Now, something happened on the very first day that I had the MU2 in my system that if this was a conventional review, I would not be bringing this up because it's not actionable information that anyone can base their purchasing decision on. And I'm saving it for this deep in the video because I think a lot of other points should come first. But here we are now. And so what happened on that first day was a big influence on my decision. And because this is about my journey, here goes. I cried. And not just like I got misty-eyed, but like streams of tears. And I really apologize about this terrible photo, but I just had to tell my wife, and this is sort of how ugly it looked. And I get that I'm being super personal here, and if you've never experienced anything like this from music, you might be a little bit weirded out right now. Now, I am very easily moved by music, perhaps even unusually so. I can give myself goosebumps by just thinking about music, which actually happened in a video quite recently. And this emotional connection is probably a fundamental reason why I have this many records and why I've spent this much on sound. I'm simply wired to get a very strong emotional response to music. But the reactions I had on day one with the MU2 was still something out of the ordinary, even for me. Now, I don't expect anyone else to have this same reaction. I'm not saying this is a DAC that makes you cry, nor am I saying that this sort of sensory overload reaction is some sort of useful marker for audio quality. It's just an anecdote about my decision-making journey in this particular case. Now on day 2, I didn't have that same reaction at all. Maybe because I was now anticipating it a little bit and bracing for it, sort of. And if it hadn't ever happened again, I would have just chalked it up to some weirdo emotional instability and never mentioned it. But it wasn't a one-time thing. I've had this sensation return several times since then. So if you are trying to understand how anyone could ever pay this much for a piece of stereo equipment, I think this should be part of that equation. Now, I'm not sitting here crying all the time. There are other sort of psychotropic reactions as well. I've repeatedly felt a sort of intoxication, as if consciousness changes material state. You know how ice melts into water, but for consciousness. And like a cognitive state change, that sounds kind of trippy, right? And it is super trippy. Again, I'm referring to it as intoxication. And this isn't new for me, but it's unusually strong when listening through the MU2, which also seems to be able to trigger this with all sorts of music, which I don't think has been the case before. So I don't think I've had this sensation occur so frequently and reliably and distinctly with digital audio until I heard the MU2. And lastly, these emotional sensations are, by definition, not things that will show up in a fast-paced A/B switching test situation. That kind of listening has its merits, and again, I used it in this very evaluation, but please understand that that is a very limited lens through which to judge equipment's ability to provide long-term musical pleasure. At this point, you might be asking, rightfully, wait a minute, aren't there tons of other super ambitious DACs in this price range? And yes, there are, for sure. Now, did I just seriously compare it to one other unit, the Playback Design MP6, and then that's it? I committed to the purchase? Yes. Yes, I did. And like, I get it. That sounds or looks really weird and stupid and reckless, maybe. But let me explain. It is possible and perhaps even plausible that there exists something out there that is even better for my tastes and needs and desires and for the same amount of money. But listening through the MU2 just made me lose all interest in looking any further. Like, I'm a curious person in general, and nearly obsessively so when it comes to sound, but the MU2 just melted that curiosity away. I simply didn't want anything else. I just sat here thinking, wait a minute, I can kind of sort of afford this thing, and if I buy it, I'll just have this sound every day forever. So that was it. Bizarrely, that makes the MU2 at once my single most expensive and also simplest audio purchase. In a more modest system, a component like this might not sound meaningfully better than something like a tenth of its price. And inversely, my system likely isn't letting the MU2 show its full potential either. I keep seeing it used in insanely ambitious and costly systems. But even if I never change anything else in my setup, I can now get an emotional response out of my 14-ish-year-old speakers that I didn't think was possible. I'm almost angry that this was, at least in theory, possible this whole time. So while nothing is perfect, I'm confident that for my tastes and needs and desires, I now have one of the best digital sources the money can buy. Some people worry about what they perceived as a dizzying rate of improvement in digital audio that they fear will, make any product obsolete practically as soon as you buy it. And, well, maybe, maybe not. I don't really care to try to predict the future, but if I look at the past, my old DAC for 14 years now, which I'll continue to use, I'm not selling it, I'm going to use it as a headphone DAC amp at my workstation, it still works and it still performs beautifully. And so if, and I do mean if, something meaningfully better comes along at or below the price of the MU2, this thing will still sound as amazing as it does now. Since the MU2 is so highly dependent on a third-party software platform, all the good intentions of Grimm Audio could be meaningless if Roon somehow goes away. And this is a real risk, but Roon has been around for 10 years and seems more popular now than ever. And besides, Roon was recently acquired by Harman International, and yes, acquisitions aren't always great for the product, I'm aware of that. I am, however, personally less concerned about its future now than I was before. You get to decide your own risk tolerance here. I just think we'll be fine. Now, what if I want to replace the streamer? Then I'll regret not buying separates, right? Well, again, the day that some part of the MU2 is meaningfully outdone by some technology that does not yet exist, it is still going to sound as good as it does today. And if I do want to upgrade, I might as well upgrade the whole thing. Besides, this argument actually assumes that I could get this kind of sound from separate components for the same price today, and I sincerely doubt that. So if I want this sound today, it comes in a single box. Isn't this a very stupid use of money? You could invest it and make it grow, or whatever. If this purchase seems stupid to you, then it is probably not the right choice for you. It's actually that easy. And as I'm sure you're aware, you are not me. You have free will, you have agency, which includes the ability to resist buying an MU2. But yes, this much money could be used for a lot of other things, including investing it to make it grow. For the record though, I bought this with money that I had invested and that had grown. You decide how much you want to enjoy the present versus investing in the future. I made this choice. Well, nobody needs a sports bike or a racing boat or a luxury watch or a month-long stay in the Seychelles, or however you pronounce that little island nation. In fact, all of those things seem like incredibly unattractive value to me. And before I had heard and experienced the MU2, I didn't think a streamer DAC at this price seemed reasonable either. This thing just changed my mind. Is the MU2 absolute perfection then? No, nothing is actually. I get that the space on the back panel is limited, and I get that Grimm feels that the MU2 can't be bettered by an external DAC, so why would anyone ever need digital out? But I'm a little annoyed that they couldn't even fit a single SpeedIF output on there. A fault that I expect that they can fix in software, but as of right now still persists, is that when it switches bitrate, there's sometimes a click in the output, like a single transient spike, and not just the relay clicking inside of the machine. It's not loud enough that I think it's going to harm my speakers, but it really doesn't sound like it should be there. Adding music to the internal SSD is done by manually mounting it in your operating system and then dragging files over like a network drive. This is fine, but I can imagine a smoother process here, such as those offered by many NAS products today, for example. Now this is a full-blown Linux computer sitting in your network, and if you want to use Roon Arc, you also need to open ports in your firewall for it. But you don't have root access to the MU2, which can be a security concern. I've done some basic intrusion probing on the MU2, and it shows that the OS seems sensibly set up and protected, but I would personally have trusted a Mac OS device more, for example, simply because there's so many Mac OS devices out in the wild, so if a vulnerability is found, a fix is likely more rapidly developed and distributed. How often there's going to be updates to any security loopholes in the MU2, I don't know. On the other hand, Linux is fairly safe if you know what you're doing, and so far it seems like Grimm know what they're doing. And so lastly, the MU2 has left me with one huge, almost painful problem, actually. And that is, what do I need all this vinyl for now that digital at long last sounds this fantastic? Now, I want to know if there's something you want to know. With a regular review, the review unit is usually returned to the store or distributor by the time that the review is published, but this thing is not going anywhere. So if there's something you want to learn more about, or something you want me to try, or you're considering purchasing one and there's something you need to figure out first, let me know and I'll be sure to make future videos about this thing, because I'm just, as you can tell by now, obsessed with this. So there will be more MU2 content on this channel. But this video is way too long already, so if you're somehow still here, thank you so very much for watching. I promise future videos will be a little bit shorter. See you in the next one.